My name is Stephen Fagan. I'm the museum's associate curator, and we're very glad that you could be here today for the second in our series of living history programs that we're doing this year to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. One of my responsibilities at the museum is our ongoing oral history project. It's a dynamic and ongoing initiative that has captured more than 1,000 personal stories about the life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy. And every so often we find a unique speaker, a gifted storyteller who we invite back to the museum to participate in one of these sessions where we're here before a live audience and give all of you the chance to become oral historians and ask questions of our participant. There are probably many of you in the audience that remember where you were on November 22nd, 1963, and we at the museum feel that everyone has a story worth sharing. So if you would like to be part of the museum's ongoing oral history project, please go onto our website, jfk.org, and you can get in touch with me, and it'd be my pleasure to record an interview with you either here at the museum or by telephone if you're visiting us from out of town, and we can add you to this tapestry of living history that we're building at the museum. A couple of things, just please make sure your cell phones are muted or turned off for the program today. And hopefully when you walked in, you received question cards. We will be collecting those later in the program, and I'll try to go through as many of those as we can with our guest here today. And with that, I want to introduce our guest today. James Waymon Rose is a decorated World War II fighter pilot, and at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, he was a traveling salesman with a furniture manufacturer. And Waymon catapulted to fame when he was chosen as juror number 10 in the Jack Ruby trial in 1964. And Waymon has been a great friend to this museum. He and his late wife Ann donated not only the journals they both kept at the time of the Ruby trial, but they also donated some wonderful scrapbooks and a lot of other material that we are honored to have here at our institution. And I'm pleased to say that next month, Waymon will celebrate his 91st birthday. So if you would, please join me. Waymon, thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you at our museum and to talk about your little piece of the Kennedy assassination story and its history. Let's start off with your memories of November 22nd. You were in Houston, right, at the time of the assassination?
Yes. I was in Houston having lunch with a customer, and the music going on in the restaurant was playing music, of course, and they suddenly broke the music and began the live broadcast from Dallas. And amazingly enough, the restaurant, which seated probably had 300 people in it, they quieted down because they realized what was going on. And everybody listened in absolute surprise because they couldn't believe such a thing was happening in Dallas. And that day I finished up. I think it was late. It was lunchtime then, but I stayed there till about 3 o'clock, and I came home from there and saw a place in person then.
How long after the death of the president did you get that jury summons in the mail?
Well, again, I was traveling on the road, and I was in New Orleans and on a sales trip. And I don't patronize a Bourbon Street except when I go on vacation. But she called me one evening because she always knew how she could get me. We didn't have cell phones in those days, and but I left an itinerary so she could reach me anytime, day or night. And she called me, and just to pass the time of night, as it were, and she mentioned that I got a jury summons that day, and I said, I'll get off of that because I've had jury summons before, and no sense in being upset about it. Well, she says, this is something to think about. Says, this is for the Jack Ruby jury. They sent out 900 summons, and you're one of them. And I said, well, I'll still get off. 900 other people there, they can't just pick me out of that bunch. So I didn't think much about it, and that was about somewhere around February 1st, and that was meant that next Monday, whenever it came up, I was supposed to be at the courthouse at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so I, sure enough, showed up down there with 300 or 299 others, because they only asked 300 to come that day, because the other 600, they had said that they were being considered for call to jury if needed and to stand by. So I guess these were extras that they were going to use in case they didn't find 12. So to go on with this, we met in this large room, and they began calling out a name, and as they called out a name, you say here, and the first person he'd be pointed to and said, "You're number one," and go and read every name, and as they answered, "You're number two, number three," and so on. Well, I ended up as number 129 out of that 300. So I felt, well, pretty comfortable, because you know, all they need is 12 people.
Right.
And out of 128 before me, they got to find 12. I didn't have any problem at all with that.
But they only found 9 before they got to 129.
Well, yes. A week and 4 days later, this was on a Monday when I first went, and Friday of the second week at noon, I was sitting there with 3 or 4 other prospective jurors, and they called out my name, J. Waymon Rose. Well, that's me. And I got up and went in the courtroom, and I'd never seen such a place. It was a madhouse. There were people hanging from the rafters. Policemen everywhere. I saw television personalities, anchored people, and reporters, and columnists. You name it, they were there en masse, and running in and out of the place. It was a real madhouse. And anyway,
you got your first look at Jack Ruby at that time.
Yes, I saw Mr. Ruby and Mr. Belli, his attorney, and their 2 assistants. And I met I saw Mr. Henry Wade, who was a district attorney, and his assistants. So I got quickly acquainted with all these people. The first thing they did was they played the 20 questions with me. They were asking me my name, my address, and everything else about me, and I tried to be frank and honest with them, because there's no place to go and tell long stories. And I thought, well, this is going to be real easy, because I had a plan in my mind that I was not going to be on their jury. I had no indication in my mind, or no resolve at all to be on it, and I figured I was a smooth enough talker that I'd get off of that. But that was my first misapprehension. I had 2 or 3 others, but that was the first one that I was denied.
You told a particularly interesting sports-related anecdote which really sealed the deal that got you on that jury. Tell us what that was.
Well, there were actually 3 that got me on there, because I appeared to be, I guess, had some knowledge of what Mr. Belli was going to plead, because I didn't know what he was going to plead, and I cared less, but because I was going home in a few minutes, I thought. But the first question they asked me was, did I believe that a person could do an improper act and know better, but do it anyway? And I said, yes, I remember the Cotton Bowl game here in 1954, and I do remember 1954, in case you don't remember that. Alabama was here playing Rice University, and Dickie Mago, who was a halfback for Rice, got the ball. He was on about Alabama 10-yard line, and he ran through the Alabama team, and was on the sidelines going for a sure touchdown. And Tommy Lewis, the captain of the Alabama team, jumped up off the bench and ran onto the field and tackled him right there in the middle of God and everybody. And of course he realized what he had done, and sheepishly got up and virtually crawled back to the bench and buried his head. You never saw his face again the whole ball game. And of course they gave him a touchdown, but I'm sure he regretted that move. In fact, if he's still living, I saw an article not too long ago about where he said that he regretted that act to this day. He says, "Nobody lets me forget it." So anyway, that was the first thing that Mr. I think the DA asked me that question, and that was the first thing that indication that I had anything was going wrong. And then he asked me, did I believe that a person could do a dangerous or perilous act and have no recall of it? And that one I had pondered in my mind before. He's going to ask, I bet you the man's going to plead epilepsy or some kind of a mental problem, and he's going to check all that stuff. So I'll get off of this jury because I'll tell him I'm too smart for all this. I know what he's doing, and he'll think so, and he'll let me off. Well, I said, yes, I remember. I know a person. I said, during the war, I flew with the Navy, and on one flight, we flew a pretty hairy flight. And as we always did, we got back to the carrier and went to debriefing and told in detail what had happened, what we'd done, and so on. That's how they kept the record straight. And but this pilot, he had no idea whatsoever what happened to him after he took off until he landed back aboard an hour, 2 hours later. So I said, yeah, I know how the person could do something like that. And I looked over at Belli and then at Henry Wade, and they were both smiling. And I thought, what did I do? What are these guys smiling about? And I still had no idea about any of that stuff. So then Belli asked me, did I have any idea about or any knowledge about how our men who were captured by the Koreans broke during interrogation. You know, they were tortured and kept hungry and all kind of stuff to them. So I said, yes, I have a good knowledge of that because I'm in the Navy Reserve and I've made a broad study in a Navy leadership about just that problem. And in fact, it's resulted in a change of the Uniform Code of Justice that the Department of Defense has service people live by. So yeah, I know how that could happen. Well, the first thing I know, they both, the district attorney and Belli, jump up and say, we'd be proud to have this man for the jury. And I'm sitting there stunned. First thing I know, I'm holding up my hand and swearing that I'll be a good juryman. And I could not understand that because I came to find out later that that was, I set a record for brevity of being on the witness stand. The other 9 ahead of me, the least amount of time that one juror had was 48 minutes he spent, but 4 or 5 others spent 2 hours, 3 hours in there being interrogated before they got taken. So here I got out in 14 minutes. And
I have here the 1964 book that was written by the defense attorney Melvin Belli, and I want to read a little passage from this. I promised Waymon I would read this, actually.
Thank you. I paid for it.
Rose was a tall, handsome man with dark hair receding from a high forehead, prominent cheekbones, a long, flat nose, dark, direct eyes, and an authoritative manner of speech. It came out that he had retired from the Naval Reserve the previous year after long service, which had included sitting in on 2 court-martials. This is where it's interesting. Melvin Belli, Jack Ruby's lead defense attorney. He was our lead juror, and after saying to the judge with deep sincerity, we accept this juror, we want this juror, I leaned over my book and wrote, our best juror. By look and tell, he's emotional. Intelligent, too. Looks like a Latin. I have a rapport. I'm amazed Wade took him. So you clearly impressed Jack Ruby's attorney, Melvin Belli, and you were exactly right that Melvin Belli's defense was that Jack Ruby suffered from a rare type of epilepsy, psychomotor epilepsy, and wasn't aware of his actions. What did you and the other members of the Ruby juror, once the trial got started on March 4th, 1964, what did you make of this psychomotor epilepsy defense?
Well, it bothered me because he began then to say that Jack Ruby suffered from a variant psychomotor. And the variant part was another type of epilepsy that would cause the person who had it to forget things that he had done, and which was one thing that trapped me, because if he had that, then he really didn't remember shooting Oswald. So that bothered me to the extent that no wonder I got tripped up, because I fell over my own my own statements.
Let's take a moment. We'll come back to the trial, but I want to talk about what life was like for you when you were sequestered for so long as part of this jury. Give us a sense of what your day-to-day activities were. I know that the Dallas County Sheriff's Department, they took you out to breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, they took us out after that first meal. When I got sworn in, it was lunchtime, so they took me and put me in these quarters, which I laughingly called our apartments. They were small. Rooms were 6-7 feet square. Had a single bed. Some of you might have seen the pictures that were shown here before this started. It had a twin bed in it. It had a commode and a wash basin. Had an air vent in the ceiling. It had a light hanging down by a long cord with no shade, just a bulb. And I kept saying to everybody, I confess, I confess, I confess. But there was no windows. You couldn't see out. You didn't know if it was day or night. And it was really, I was in jail like the guys below and above us. This was an apartment between the 5th and 6th floor of the county jail. We could hear the prisoners down there banging their utensils against the bars. We could hear all kinds of stuff day and night, from 10 o'clock at night until 5 o'clock. It was quiet, but then at 5 o'clock that noise began, and it was just absolutely maddening. So my wife fortunately brought a notebook up there at the first day, and asked me to keep a diary for the kids. So I was writing a lot of time, but trying to be distracted by it. But we had no radio, television, or anything, and had no books. I had nothing to read. She brought me a Bible the second day, because I had the sheriff tell her to bring me something to read, and she knew that she couldn't bring me any magazines or anything, so she brought me a Bible. So that was all I had to do, was to read the Bible or write my diary. So I got both done pretty well to my satisfaction.
We have a little bit of footage of that apartment, or cell as you've referred to it at times. Let's take a look at that and get a sense of what it was like for you when you were sequestered.
Much of the time of a juror on the Ruby case, or in any case as far as that goes, is spent in these quarters on floor 7M of the Dallas County Criminal Courts building. The rooms are small but adequate, using equipment purchased from hotels. Each room has a single bed, a private lavatory, and a sink, along with a bookcase to keep any books and magazines which the jurors may be permitted to have. During the time they are on the jury member will spend his time either here in the jury quarters, in the jury room or the courtroom itself, or else going out to eat with the rest of the jury members and a bailiff. All contact to the outside world is done through the authorization of the judge through his bailiffs. Any messages which have to be sent to the family back and forth must go through the bailiff and the judge. The hallways are equipped with special hinges on which doors can be placed to separate the men from the women's quarters. The doors can be placed at any point along the hallway, depending on how many women or how many men are on the jury panel. If the juror has a little leisure time, which he wants to spend out of his room, he can come in here, which is kind of an assembly room or game room for for the jurors. In here they can play cards, talk, read books, or even have a cup of coffee from a coffee pot brought into the room and heated on this electric stove placed here for the jurors.
Extraordinary, the conditions under which you live for quite some time. And you weren't able to have direct communication with your family, your wife or your children, but you found a unique way of getting messages to them and seeing them at times. Tell us about that.
Well, I would call, or I'd have the sheriff call my wife every day, because I got some mail and communications from the factories I represented from time to time. So she would open my mail every day, and if there's anything important that I should read, although they knew where I was, I still got the normal communications. But the sheriff was good enough to call her every day for me, and I'd stand there and ask questions. He'd ask her, and then he'd relay it back to me. So it was a three-way conversation. We decided that, or the sheriff had decided on that second day, that we were subject to too much harassment on the streets when we walked to a restaurant near the courthouse. So then he ordered automobiles to take us with the sheriff's bailiffs or deputy sheriffs to take us to any place we wanted to eat all 3 meals a day. So we would decide in the mornings where, for example, we would eat at some certain place that evening. So I'd tell the sheriff, I said, tell her that we're going to eat at so-and-so tonight, about 7:30, and so he'd tell her that. And then I say to him, I tell her that I love her, and so he says he loves you, and then he looks back up to me and says, she loves you too. So anyway, we'd go into the restaurant that night, and then we'd walk in there. We got all these cops with us, and I look over to the side, and here's my wife and her mother and my 3 children. And I know after I got home, after this was all over, my wife told me that my daughter, who was then almost 6 years old, she asked her mother, she said, "Mother, which one is Jack Ruby?" You know, so I thought that's pretty clever for a 6 or 5-year-old girl. So anyway, that was the way we did. Every meal we ate out and we had the sheriff's deputies with us because we were subject to people shouting to us, and some of whom got picked up and taken to jail, or at least I got a good lecture from the deputy that got to them. So I learned right then to don't try to speak to any juror that you think may be walking down the street, because they can put you away for that.
Well, let's talk about Jack Ruby for a minute, who didn't, by the way, go to dinner with you every night, unfortunately.
Yeah,
that might have been interesting. Now, sitting there in the jury box, looking at Jack Ruby every day, did you feel like you were looking at an innocent man who got caught up under intense circumstances, or did you think he was guilty?
No, I didn't think that he was guilty or innocent. I hadn't reached that point. I had no reason to believe really legally that he was either one. I was trying to keep my mind open for the evidence. But I felt very sorry for Jack Ruby. He looked alone. He looked forlorn. He just really looked pitiful. He never said anything, never smiled. I made eye-to-eye contact with him once or twice, is all, because he was in another world, seemed like, all the time. I know that one time the district attorney, the assistant district attorney, excuse me, who worked with Henry Wade, he and the other team, they were very sharply critical of Jack Ruby, because they would malign him. They would almost heckle him, because they called him the village idiot and all kinds of names in court. And this district attorney, I heard him say something about him, that Jack Ruby just sitting there. He said, doesn't he remind you of looking into the eyes of a crab? And I thought, that's an awful thing to say, but then I looked at him and I thought, well, it does look like a crab. You know, his eyes were sort of fixed and had a vacant stare, I guess you'd say. And he looked like he was feeling his way through the world. And I really felt sorry for him. I just wanted him to say something and apologize and say, I'm sorry, and let's all go home, and I would have gone with it. But it didn't work that way.
And Ruby never took the stand during the trial, never spoke in his own defense.
Ruby would not let him talk. He wanted to say something, and all this time, Belli, he was not a comical look. He looked sharp as he could be. He had a solid color silk suit, Italian suit on, wore half boots, and he had a brocaded vest and a watch chain dangling around across the vest pockets. And he had white hair, and it was combed back softly, fluffy like. It looked like a real San Francisco carpetbagger is what I thought it looked like.
We're going to hear from Melvin Belli in just a moment.
He is a very clever man. He was very knowledgeable. He using medical terms that of old original terms and contemporary terms, of medical terms, that things I'd never heard of, and he could use them in various ways and tenses, and like he invented those drugs. And I thought he was a very brilliant man. And I liked him. I enjoyed listening to him.
Yet despite his defense, it only took a couple of hours for that jury to deliver a guilty verdict of murder with malice. Take us into the jury room for those final deliberations, and what ultimately brought you to that guilty verdict?
Well, as the evidence unfolded, it was very simple, really, if you could separate this EKG, this encephalologic, whatever it's called.
Okay.
I forget the terms now, that's such big words. But you could see that the evidence that Belli was trying to present was fiction. You could tell that even though he had researched, he had all these witnesses that testified in Ruby's favor, that they didn't know what they were saying. One prominent person, Mr. Gibbs, had founded an EKG society, and after a couple of years, he himself resigned from the thing that he had founded, simply because he disagreed with what some of the other members felt like. So he was a heretic in that matter, and I think Henry Wade said as much during the trial. But we didn't have any problem in the deliberations. We were charged by the court to make certain decisions on certain items. One was, did he do it? And of course, during the trial, we saw the films that everybody else saw him being shot, and we saw him in regular motion. We saw him one frame at a time, slow motion, any way you can think of. We saw them twice, and there was no doubt that he did it. And we, in one vote, decided that he was sane, and we, in one vote, voted that he did it deliberately. So there was nothing for us to decide further except to decide on his penalty, which is where we had a small problem. We had two holdouts on the first vote, who all the rest of the other 10 voted death. And then we took another vote after some talking. And we took another vote, and we had one holdout. And I could see that we weren't getting anywhere, but we were conscious of arriving at a decision too quickly, because we didn't want, people were sharply critical of Dallas anyway, and over this assassination. and we didn't want to be a lynch mob. So we wanted to, under some pretense of trying him legally, which we did. We were all very careful about not doing or saying anything that might cause a mistrial. We sure didn't want to go through any of that again or have anybody else do it. And we just couldn't, I couldn't wait to get out of there and get home, so I told the group, excuse me, that we've been there for 33 days already. It's the 34th day, and I want to go home. And I said, we've had this evidence presented to us, one after another, testifying. And I said, I listen, and everybody else listened, and whoever's holding out here, if you haven't listened, what have you been doing? What are you doing here anyway if you don't pay attention to what's going on? Well, then we took another vote, and we had a solid 12 vote. So I was Belli's lead juror, all right. I led them down the primrose path, but I led them where I thought they ought to go, so that's what we did.
Well, let's take a look at that verdict broadcast live on television, and we'll also hear some of defense attorney Melvin Belli's instant reactions to that guilty verdict.
Judge Brown on the bench, 30 years on the bench in Dallas. A candidate for office 14 times, elected 14 times, never defeated. He ran 6 times without opposition. He is running at this moment without opposition.
Yeah.
Judge Joe B. Brown, Joe Brantley Brown. His son is a justice of the peace in Dallas. Like father, like son.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have reached a verdict in this case. May I have it, Sheriff, please?
There is the verdict. O'Mabra handing it to the judge.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder with malice as charged in the indictment and assess his punishment at death. Signed, Max E. Causey, Foreman. So say you all, ladies and gentlemen. Is that your unanimous verdict? Will all of you whose verdict that is, please hold up your right hands. All right, Sheriff, here's your prisoner.
May I thank this jury for a victory for
Keep your seats, please. There'll be no moving out. Don't let anybody out of the courtroom.
every one of these jurors that will appeal this to a court where there is justice, just not only law.
And make these people of Dallas ashamed of themselves.
What's your next step, Mr. Belli?
Appeal.
Where?
Appeal. Today.
Mr. Belli, I don't like to make you repeat this, but the live camera just got here a few moments ago.
Railroad? This is a kangaroo railroad. And every one of you know it, too.
What's your...
I hope the people of Dallas are proud of this jury that was shoved down our throat. One juror, before he sat on that jury, told his employee that if he got on the Ruby jury, he'd vote the death penalty. Another juror waved at the policeman when they were on the witness stand. Her nephew does the public relations work for the police department.
How do you feel about Judge Brown? How do you think he handled the case? Mr. Belli, your opinion on Judge Brown?
He went down the line for every motion that the district attorney made, and they led him into some 30 errors. And every Texas jurist knows this thing was the greatest railroading kangaroo court disgrace in the history of American law.
They disregarded your entire psychiatric case?
They disregard every bit of our psychiatric testimony. They disregarded every witness who was sworn. And you heard last night when those jurors looked at us and said, we don't want to have any argument. We've had our mind made up. Now, that was the nod when the judge said, do you want to go ahead? They didn't even want recess. Why, in a civilized country in the heart of darkest Africa, you wouldn't argue a man's life starting at 12 o'clock in the morning. When I think we're coming into Holy Week and Good Friday to have a sacrifice like this, I think we're back 2,000 years. And the blight that's on Dallas with those 12 people who announced the death penalty in this case, they'll make this a city of shame forevermore. And I'm going to participate in it, too, when I write this appeal.
Mr. Belli, Mr. Tonnehill, your associate is a Texan. What's your reaction to it?
It's a violent miscarriage of justice.
Anything else to add to that, Mr. Tonnehill?
I'm about to throw up.
Mr. Belli did his utmost to represent his client. So did Mr. Tonnehill. And I have no complaint of Mr. Belli and Mr. Tonnehill. I think they're both fine lawyers. And I think Mr. Belli is one of the most brilliant attorneys that's ever appeared in my court. And I was glad to have him. And I think a great deal of him as a lawyer and as a man. And I have no complaint against Mr. Belli. I think he's probably in the throes of an emotional state now himself. And I think he's a fine man.
All right. And before we lead into our questions, I want to give Waymon the last word. But Waymon, from 1964, we're going to take a quick look at an interview you gave about a month after the verdict in the trial.
Waymon, is there any doubt in your mind today about the verdict you reached a month ago?
None whatsoever, because in a lot of evidence that, or opinions that I have gotten since the trial was over, I'm certain that Mr. Ruby had planned this prior to the time that he did shoot Oswald.
All right, and that leads us into our Q&A. Waymon, here we are nearly half a century after the events we're talking about. Any regrets about that guilty verdict or about the fact that ultimately that guilty verdict was thrown out and Ruby was preparing for a new trial when he died in '67?
No, I have only one thing or two things I want to say. You know, coming to or listening to a testimony in a trial like this, you got to have second, third, and fourth thoughts about what you are accumulating in your mind, and whether you have your mind made up at the end of it or not. You have to think. You have to be aware of the fact that you cannot depend on making a decision based on how eloquent the attorney is in his closing arguments. Because I've seen or I've heard of people who actually had their minds changed, which is a reason for a closing argument. There may be attorneys here, I know of one is here, but had experience with that, but I know how people's minds can be changed, some can, and that's what the closing arguments are for. But I was aware that I certainly was not going to have it influence me. I had carefully evaluated all the evidence, and I had no misgivings, and I think these people whom I came to know, you know, if you're living with a person or persons, as I was for 34 days, you come to know a lot about them, especially in the closeness that we were together. And I know these people were sincere. They were everybody had a high school education. There were 4 who had college degrees. If I am ever charged, I'd like to have a jury that intelligent to try me. So I think he was very fortunate of having a good jury, and they were sincere in what they did.
Of course, that guilty verdict was overturned by the Court of Criminal Appeals in Austin. How did you feel after all that time and effort and energy that you and the other jurors put into this trial, but ultimately the verdict was thrown out?
Well, we were, I'm sure we were disappointed. I haven't talked to any of those people since then. I did intend to stay in contact, but I never heard from anybody, so I returned the favor. But I know that during the trial, and if I can digress a little and go back to the trial,
it's your show.
Mr. Belli was talking about a photocopy of a Sergeant Dean. Sergeant Dean was a city policeman, a detective, and he was at the time that Ruby shot Oswald. Sergeant Dean immediately collared Ruby and took him away. And I can't repeat what Ruby said, even even on board ship. But But he took him and also a government agent named Sorrells. They went up into the jail and they interviewed Ruby. And the photocopy that Belli had in his hand, he turned to the judge and he said that they were talking about this phase of the testimony. Detective Dean was Sergeant Dean was on the witness stand. And Belli complained to the judge that he wanted a copy of that report that Dean had made. And the judge told him, he said, "You've got a copy." And Belli said, "No." He said, "I want the original." He said, "Are we living in the dark ages that I can't see an original of a police report?" And Judge Brown said, "Yes, I'm afraid we are." But anyway, what they had done, Sergeant Dean and Sorrell, they had taken statements from Ruby before he was privileged to get any counsel. This was before they passed the Miranda rule and all that stuff. So that was in the original report, but it was left out, and the judge denied Ruby Belli seeing the original statement, because if they had brought that out, there certainly would have been a mistrial. And I made, as one author of a book remarked, and said that Rose sure had an acute knowledge of what was going on, because I wrote in my diary that night that if anything had further had come out about that if he was lying, that there would have been a mistrial, and sure enough, that was a fact.
That's exactly right. Let's go on to another question. There were several in this stack that ask about Jack Ruby's possible involvement with others, part of a conspiracy. Did you ever get a sense then or now that Ruby was involved with the mafia or was part of any sort of conspiracy?
No, I've heard the rumors. I'm sure everybody else has, but it was never brought up about anybody working with him or accomplice or anything. So I had no reason to. And the state was not interested in who else was involved. They wanted Jack Ruby, and they got the verdict that they wanted, the state did. So it just never came up during the trial.
Had you ever heard of Jack Ruby before his shooting of Oswald?
Yes, I privileged, quote unquote, took my wife to his club one night, because my wife grew up and was I guess raised in a politely decent household, and she had never heard anything about strippers and all that sort of thing. So we were married, so I thought it was my legal right to take her she wanted to go, so I did. And we went to Jack Ruby's place because they advertised in the paper every Friday, Saturday, I think, for the weekend. And which was where he was at the newspaper at the very time that Kenny was doing the parade here. Ruby sat over at the Dallas News office going over the same ad they read every week, no changes, same ad, and he could have done that on the telephone. But because he claimed after the assassination that he loved Ruby so much that he was trying to save the state and everybody a trial by killing Oswald. But if he loved the president as much as he claimed to, he would have been on the street with everybody else when the parade was going down. So it didn't mean anything at all to me or anybody else.
What was Jack Ruby's demeanor, his facial expressions during the course of the trial?
He was just almost a stoic, almost a statue. He never made, now and again, he'd say something or Belli would say something to him, but they never had any huddles and never got any serious. He was just almost a robot.
I think this is the last question we're going to have time for today. I'll paraphrase it a little bit. Jury service is something that a lot of us don't really appreciate. We don't like to get jury summons in the mail, and yet that has become your link to one of the most important historic events of the 20th century. How does it feel to be a part of this story and to have been asked to recall your experiences as part of this jury so many times over the years?
Well, it's, of course, it's made my life much different than what it might have been. I've been involved in things that have been publicized and so on, and I feel honored now that it's being recognized as an event that I should be proud of, and I am proud because I think every citizen should serve their community. I think every citizen should vote and exercise his right. I think every citizen should go and serve in the armed forces if he's offered the job. I just feel that if he's called for a jury duty, that's a part of the price of freedom. And that's a trouble, or one trouble that we're having in this country right now, that people don't realize the value of what freedom really means to them. And I would urge any of us to run for office or do something civic or help your neighbor, vote, and everything else that you're supposed to do to help us keep those freedoms.
All right, Waymon. I want to encourage you to fill out your survey cards because they do help us in planning future programs at the museum. I want to thank you for your patience today and thank you for being part of this program. Please join me in thanking Waymon Rose.